The logbook surfaced in a house that had not heard a human voice in more than 4 decades, a place abandoned not by choice, but by the slow erosion of memory that comes when the last person who knew how to unlock its secrets dies quietly in a care home. The fireplace had been sealed with plaster in the late 60s, a decision made by an owner who wished to forget that the house had ever belonged to a man wanted by multiple governments. When the new residents pried the cover loose, after noticing a faint draft creeping through the aging bricks, they did not expect to find a thin cavity carved deliberately into the stone. Inside, wrapped in linen so brittle it disintegrated at a touch, rested a logbook whose pages had turned the color of weak tea. Scrawled across the front in black ink, faded but unmistakable, was the name Edwin Clark, the last known Nazi codebreaker to defect to the Allies before vanishing into England's rural outskirts in the aftermath of D-Day. His disappearance had always troubled historians. Clark had been born in Coventry, educated in mathematics at Cambridge, and conscripted early into the war effort as a cryptanalyst. His gift for recognizing patterns bordered on the uncanny, and his defection to the Allies in 1943 had been hailed as a major intelligence coup. Yet scarcely a year later, only weeks after the Allied landings in Normandy, he left his outpost at Bletchley Park without permission and vanished without trace. No body was found, no personal effects recovered, no rumors circulated, except those whispered in smoke-filled rooms where officers speculated that he had been captured, assassinated, or perhaps surrendered willingly to an enemy whose reach still permeated Europe like a lingering poison. The resurfacing of his logbook threatened to unseal these speculations and breathe life into the possibility that Clark's final days had not been a quiet fade into obscurity, but a descent into something more sinister. What made the find even more perturbing was the condition of the house itself. The floorboards sagged, swollen by decades of damp. Wallpaper curled from the walls like peeling skin, yet nothing aside from the fireplace cavity suggested purposeful concealment. No secret compartments inside furniture, no hidden drawers, no coded messages scribbled in margins. Whoever had hidden the logbook had done so quickly, perhaps in fear, and never returned to reclaim it. The family who moved in merely wished to refurbish the property, unaware that the walls around them had once held a man whose mind had been fought over by nations. When they delivered the logbook to a local historian, expecting perhaps a ledger or household record, they triggered a chain of events that revived suspicions long considered historical footnotes. The first pages of the logbook were calm, clinical, typical of a man accustomed to documenting every nuance of his work. Clark wrote in neat strokes, describing long hours spent decoding intercepted communications, the cold air inside the huts at Bletchley, and the tension that thrummed beneath every conversation as the war stretched on with no definitive end in sight. Yet even in these early entries, a sense of strain seeped through his words, as though he were aware that the shadow of his former allegiance followed him like a persistent echo. The British officers who supervised him trusted his abilities, but not always his intentions. There were mentions of monitoring, of polite but insistent questioning, of subtle reminders that he remained a man whose loyalties had been reshaped by circumstance rather than a lifelong conviction. This uneasy dynamic formed the backdrop to his work on the complex cipher transmissions that Nazi command had intensified shortly after the invasion began. Midway through the first month's entries, the tone shifted abruptly. Clark began to describe dreams that felt less like the product of fatigue and more like the manifestation of something he could not name. He wrote of numbers that rearranged themselves into shapes in the air above him, of intercepted messages whose patterns seemed to whisper to him long after he had left the decoding room. He mentioned cold spots in Hut 6, places where the lamps flickered even when the wiring had been checked, and declared sound. His colleagues dismissed these accounts as the strain of prolonged overwork. Yet Clark insisted that he could sense an intelligence inside the transmissions, something aware, something watching. It was also in these entries that he began documenting peculiar inconsistencies in certain German messages, as though someone on the other end were signaling outside the boundaries of military ordnance. The details were vague, clouded by Clark's increasing anxiety, but he hinted at a thread of communication that seemed to bypass official channels entirely. It was around this point of the log that the historian paused, reading the lines over again, wondering if Clark's mental state had deteriorated or if he had indeed stumbled upon something that remained undiscovered by wartime archivists. And this is the moment where you, watching from wherever you are, become part of the unfolding mystery. Tell me softly in the comments, from where are you watching this video? It helps anchor these shadows in the world of the living, even as we travel further into the one Clark left behind. As the entries continued, the tone darkened. Clark began referring to an unnamed figure who appeared to him in brief glances, sometimes reflected in the glass of the decoding machines, sometimes standing behind officers during strategy briefings, sometimes visible only at the edge of lamplight during late-night walks back to his quarters. The figure was always described the same way: tall, wearing a coat too long for the style of the time, and carrying an expression that Clark insisted he recognized from somewhere prior to his defection. Whether this presence was real or imagined became difficult to determine as the logbook's narrative grew increasingly fragmented. Yet amid the ambiguity, Clark's technical notes remained lucid. He continued to detail the patterns he observed in the transmissions, insisting that certain messages were being sent not to military units, but directly to codebreakers like himself. Messages designed not to be decoded, but to be understood. One passage stood out with particular force. Clark described receiving a fragment transmitted at a frequency slightly out of range from the ordinary channels. Upon adjusting the equipment, he recorded a series of numbers that repeated in a loop. When arranged according to a method he claimed had come to him in a dream, the numbers formed coordinates to a remote area in the English countryside. He mentioned requesting leave to investigate, but being denied due to the intensifying operations following the success at Normandy. His frustration became palpable. The logbook's handwriting grew erratic as he insisted that the message was meant specifically for him. He believed that someone with intimate knowledge of his past, possibly someone still loyal to the Reich, was calling him out, drawing him toward a rendezvous or a trap. The most disquieting part of these entries is the manner in which Clark wrote about his own mind. He seemed aware that he was becoming unreliable, yet he refused to dismiss his observations as hallucinations. Instead, he argued that the work of code-breaking had sharpened his perception beyond that of an ordinary analyst. He claimed that once someone spent months staring into the patterns crafted by brilliant yet ruthless minds, those patterns began to stare back. He described the messages as possessing a cadence that pulsed faintly beneath the visible fabric of the ciphers, a rhythm that resonated in the bones, a whisper that insinuated itself into thoughts without permission. These descriptions, though unnervingly poetic, hinted at a psychological unraveling brought on by relentless exposure to secrecy, deception, and the crushing weight of war. In late June 1944, Clark's entries shifted once more. The unnamed figure appeared more frequently, sometimes speaking to him in clipped German phrases that Clark refused to translate in the logbook, claiming only that the words filled him with a cold dread he could not shake. He wrote of shadows in his room that did not move when he did, of footsteps trailing behind him along corridors where no one else had been scheduled to work. His colleagues noted his growing unease. A senior officer reprimanded him after he was found outside the perimeter fence late one evening, staring toward the woods as though listening for something. Clark wrote that he had expected someone to step out from between the trees, someone who had been following him since long before he arrived at Bletchley. The final entry before his disappearance described a night in which the machines fell silent for several minutes, an occurrence he insisted was impossible given the constant flow of intercepted transmissions. During the silence, Clark claimed he heard a knock on the window of Hut 6. When he looked up, he saw the tall figure standing outside, coat drenched in rain despite the sky being perfectly clear. The figure raised a hand, as if inviting him to follow. Clark wrote that he felt compelled to rise, compelled to walk toward the door, compelled to step outside into the stillness that did not belong to any natural atmosphere. He concluded the entry by stating that he finally understood the meaning of the coordinates, the purpose of the messages, and the identity of the one who had been calling him. Yet instead of recording his revelation, he ended with a single sentence. "If they find this, tell them I had no choice." This was the last known line Clark ever wrote. The historian who read those words felt a hollow drop in her stomach, the sensation of standing at the edge of a story unfinished, yet vibrating with menace. The family who found the logbook returned to their renovations, unaware that they had unearthed a fragment of a man caught between two worlds, a man who understood both the brilliance and the danger of seeing too deeply into hidden codes. And you, listening now, stand where Clark once stood, on the threshold of a mystery whose resolution was swallowed by time. What lies ahead in the remaining pages of the logbook, in the corners of the house where it was hidden, in the silence that followed his vanishing, will only grow darker the further we go. Before we continue into those depths, allow this whisper to pass through you like the echo of a forgotten transmission. If stories like this draw you into the shadows, subscribe to the channel so that these investigations reach you the moment they surface. The silence that follows might hold answers you do not expect. The discovery of Clark's logbook might have remained a curiosity confined to local archives, if not for the historian who refused to leave it buried in paperwork. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Harrow, a lecturer in modern cryptography and wartime intelligence at King's College. When she first examined the brittle pages, she noticed that the ink in certain portions of the log shimmered faintly under ultraviolet light, a peculiarity common in wartime inks treated with chemical stabilizers, but in Clark's case, it seemed almost deliberate. She took samples for analysis, and what she found unsettled her. The ink contained trace elements of vanadium, a metal sometimes used in secret correspondence to make messages visible only under specific spectrums of light. Clark, it appeared, had been writing on two levels: the visible layer, a diary of his thoughts and observations, and a second, spectral script that pulsed faintly beneath. Harrow's initial interpretation was cautious. Perhaps it was merely an experiment by a codebreaker too accustomed to secrecy, an attempt to ensure his writings could be protected if discovered. But when she photographed several of the later pages under ultraviolet and infrared light, a secondary set of characters emerged, forming fragments of words in both English and German. The sentences were partial, interrupted by stains and deterioration, yet they were unmistakably purposeful. One phrase stood out more than the rest: Die Stimmen sind in den Zahlen. The voices are in the numbers. Harrow felt an involuntary shiver trace her spine when she first read those words, voices in the numbers. She had lectured for years on the psychological toll faced by Bletchley analysts, the way sleeplessness and pressure eroded their sense of reality. Yet this was different. Clark's secondary messages were not confessions of madness. They were precise, formulaic, almost procedural. It was as though he had developed a system for recording communications that existed in a dimension between code and hallucination. She began cross-referencing the coordinates mentioned earlier in the log, overlaying them on historical maps of Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire, and found that they pointed not to military sites, but to a cluster of disused transmission stations, all decommissioned in the summer of 1944, the very period in which Clark vanished. Intrigued and increasingly unsettled, Harrow arranged a visit to one of these locations, a weathered outpost known as Station R12, hidden among overgrown hedgerows several miles from the village of Marsh Gibbon. The road leading there was barely visible beneath years of neglect. Rusted fencing leaned inward, collapsing beneath the weight of ivy. A single concrete bunker remained intact, its roof pocked with moss and rainwater. Local farmers avoided the area, claiming the place gave them headaches or made their radios hiss with static when they passed nearby. To Harrow, this only amplified the urgency of her curiosity. She carried the logbook with her, carefully sealed inside a weatherproof case, and brought a portable spectral scanner in hopes of detecting traces of the materials Clark might have used. Inside the bunker, the air was heavy with the scent of rust and mold. The walls bore the faint outlines of where equipment once stood, racks of valves, switches, dials, and cables long since stripped away. Yet the deeper she moved into the narrow chamber, the more she sensed that something of Clark's presence lingered. The silence was almost physical, dense enough that her breathing seemed intrusive. She set her scanner upon a flat surface that might once have been a control desk, switched it on, and waited for the sensors to stabilize. The screen flickered briefly, then displayed a faint electromagnetic resonance emanating from the far corner of the room. At first, she assumed it was interference from nearby power lines, until she remembered that the area had been disconnected from the grid decades earlier. She crossed to the corner, brushing aside debris, and uncovered a thin metal panel embedded in the concrete. It appeared to have been welded shut, but upon closer inspection she noticed a hairline seam running vertically down the center. Using a small chisel, she pried at the edge until the panel loosened and fell forward with a metallic groan. Behind it lay a cavity scarcely large enough for a man to crawl through. The beam of her torch caught a glint of glass, bottles perhaps, or the remnants of instrument gauges, and then she saw it. A compact radio transceiver, its components rusted but unmistakably wartime issue, bearing the manufacturer's mark of Telefunken, a German company whose equipment had been prohibited in Britain since 1939. The implications were immediate and chilling. If Clark had indeed found this device, or worse, installed it himself, then his obsession with the off-channel frequencies was not delusion, but discovery. The question became, what had he been listening to? Harrow examined the surrounding area for notes, labels, or hidden compartments, but found nothing beyond the skeletal remains of circuitry. Yet when she powered her scanner again, the readings spiked momentarily before vanishing altogether. The brief surge had no logical explanation. It was as though something in the bunker had responded to her presence, then retreated once it was acknowledged. She left shortly after, unsettled by a sense that the air itself vibrated faintly, carrying an inaudible hum that followed her all the way to the car. That night, she dreamt of static, not sound but texture, an ocean of white noise through which faint human syllables drifted like flotsam. She woke with the image of Clark's handwriting seared into her mind, the looping letters repeating that phrase again and again. The voices are in the numbers. Over the following weeks, Harrow's work consumed her. She digitized every page of the logbook, overlaying the ultraviolet fragments with the visible text until patterns began to emerge. The coded layer formed not random words, but sequences of coordinates, each leading to another decommissioned listening post. When plotted on a map, the points aligned into a precise geometric formation, an irregular hexagon spanning several counties. The pattern reminded her of radio triangulation grids used to locate signal sources during the war. But at the center of the formation lay a patch of forest known as Wendover Woods, an area Clark had referenced indirectly in his final entries. It was there that she believed the last piece of the puzzle waited. The local archives held little information about Wendover Woods in the 1940s, aside from their brief use as a temporary training ground for signal operatives. Yet a classified memo unearthed from the National Archives contained a passing reference to experimental frequency trials conducted in mid-1944 under supervision from Bletchley's external division. The memo was incomplete, its signatures redacted, but one of the initials matched Clark's. Harrow's hands trembled as she held the document. The idea that a single man could operate an unauthorized signal test during one of history's most secretive operations defied every procedural rule of wartime intelligence. Unless, of course, those above him had sanctioned it, and later buried the evidence. Driven by a mixture of academic curiosity and a growing unease that she was trespassing into something deliberately erased, Harrow obtained permission to conduct a brief survey in Wendover Woods. She brought a small team of graduate students, each sworn to confidentiality. The forest greeted them with the damp chill of early autumn, mist curling between the trunks like smoke. The ground was uneven, littered with branches and the skeletal remains of rusted equipment, half swallowed by soil. They discovered fragments of wiring, shattered vacuum tubes, and a corroded metal plate stamped with the same Telefunken insignia as the transceiver from Station R12. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to absorb sound. Their voices became muted, their footsteps muffled. One student remarked that her watch had stopped. Another claimed to hear a faint rhythmic tapping, like Morse code, echoing through the trees, though no source could be found. Harrow, determined to maintain composure, ordered the team to record ambient frequencies using portable scanners. The results were inexplicable. Faint electromagnetic oscillations repeating in cycles precisely matching the numerical sequences Clark had documented in his logbook. As night fell, they made camp near a shallow hollow that appeared to have once housed machinery. Harrow sat alone, staring into the low glow of a lantern, the logbook open on her lap. She traced the words with a gloved hand, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The silence pressed heavily around her until, almost imperceptibly, she began to hear the sound that had haunted her dreams, the soft crackle of static, not from the radio but from the darkness itself. It was subtle, barely there, yet it grew stronger when she whispered Clark's name aloud. One of her students stirred and asked if she had heard something. Harrow lied, saying it was only the wind, but she knew it wasn't. The static had rhythm, rising and falling like breathing. In the days that followed, Harrow became more withdrawn. Colleagues noticed her distraction during lectures, Friends described her as distant, haunted, yet she continued to work, compiling her findings into a report intended for publication. The report, however, was never released. Weeks later, she stopped responding to emails. Her office remained locked, her flat undisturbed except for a desk covered in pages of spectral analysis and a voice recorder still running, filled with nothing but hours of faint static. It was the caretaker who found it, and though he thought little of the noise at first, he later swore that when he played the recording again, between the crackles, he could hear a man's voice repeating a single phrase. "Tell them I had no choice." The logbook disappeared shortly after. Some say university officials confiscated it under orders from the Ministry of Defense. Others claim it was stolen. Whatever the truth, its reappearance decades later behind that forgotten fireplace would suggest one chilling possibility, that someone or something had returned it deliberately, and perhaps that someone was never entirely gone. If the shadows that follow this story resonate with you, leave a quiet, like below, one small gesture that helps keep the investigation alive, one small flicker against the darkness. Months passed before anyone officially acknowledged Dr. Evelyn Harrow's disappearance. Universities, like governments, prefer silence over scandal. Her absence was explained away through administrative jargon, extended research leave, sabbatical, personal circumstances, until those who knew her best began to sense that something more deliberate was at work. Her name faded from the faculty directory. Her office was cleared by order of the college administration, yet the room where she had once lectured remained untouched, as if the air itself resisted being disturbed. Only her assistant, a postgraduate named Martin Hale, continued to search for answers. Martin had worked closely with Harrow in the months leading to her vanishing. He remembered her as exacting, often cold but never unstable. Her fascination with Clark's logbook had bordered on obsession, yet it was an obsession fueled by methodical logic, not madness. When she stopped responding to his messages, he broke into her office one evening, convinced she had left behind something the university wished to hide. What he found was not disorder, but precision. The shelves were neatly arranged, her notes stacked in careful piles. But one thing immediately drew his attention: the faint smell of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. It clung to the room, subtle, yet undeniable. He followed the scent to the center of her desk, where a small black recorder sat beneath a heap of papers. The device was old, the kind used for dictation, its plastic casing slightly warped as though exposed to heat. When he pressed play, the speakers emitted a wash of static. For nearly a minute, nothing changed, just that whispering white noise that seemed to breathe. Then came a faint sound, like fingers brushing against metal, followed by Harrow's voice, barely above a whisper. Testing, frequency consistent, no visual anomalies. A pause, then the sound of her breathing, uneven, fast. There's something embedded in the static, a pulse. Morse, perhaps, but not Morse. It repeats at irregular intervals. I can feel it, not hear it. It's like pressure, like it's pressing behind my eyes. Her voice trailed off. The static swelled, then fell again into silence. Martin replayed the recording several times, noting the strange pattern in the noise. He transferred it to his laptop and analyzed the waveform. To his astonishment, the data revealed subtle, rhythmic peaks, too structured to be random interference. He converted them into binary, then into numerical sequences, and realized they corresponded almost exactly to the coordinates documented in Clark's logbook. Harrow had, in her final hours, rediscovered the same hidden pulse Clark claimed to have detected 80 years earlier. Over the following days, Martin became convinced that the recording was incomplete. Harrow must have made more tapes, perhaps hidden them somewhere. He scoured her apartment, contacted her colleagues, and even traced her credit history. One transaction stood out: a purchase made at a small antiques dealer in Aylesbury, dated 2 days before she vanished. When he visited the shop, the owner, a man in his 70s, remembered her vividly. She had asked for anything relating to wartime radio equipment, specifically Telefunken devices. He had shown her a battered receiver that had been part of an estate sale from a nearby cottage. The cottage's address made Martin's blood run cold. It was the same house where Clark's logbook would later be discovered. The realization struck like a thunderclap. Harrow had found the house before anyone else. She had been there before the renovations began, which meant the logbook's reappearance behind the fireplace was not the first time it had been handled in decades. It was the second, and someone had gone to great lengths to return it to its hiding place after she disappeared. Martin drove to the property under cover of night. The owners were away. Scaffolding framed the building like the bones of a carcass. He slipped through a loose board near the kitchen window and entered the house, guided by the faint blue glow of his torch. The air smelled faintly of plaster dust and cold stone. He walked through the rooms until he stood before the fireplace, the one that had concealed the logbook. The cavity had been resealed, but the mortar was fresh. He crouched, tapping the bricks gently until he found one that sounded hollow. With cautious precision, he loosened it and reached inside. His fingers touched fabric, soft, aged linen, and beneath it, something smooth and cylindrical. He withdrew a small glass vial, sealed with wax. Inside was a tightly rolled strip of paper. He unsealed it carefully. The paper was brittle, nearly translucent, but the writing was clear. It was a fragment of Clark's handwriting, unmistakable, yet the ink was darker than the rest of the logbook's entries, as if it had been preserved deliberately. It contained a single line in English: "If the voices find you, do not let them speak your name." Martin froze, feeling a prickling at the back of his neck. The house was silent, yet he sensed movement, not physical, but atmospheric, a subtle shift as though the air had turned to glass. He packed the fragment away, resealed the cavity, and left the house without looking back. Back in his flat, he continued his analysis of the recording. He filtered the static through multiple spectral layers until faint patterns began to emerge. Ghostly frequencies hidden between the peaks. The sound, when slowed, resembled human speech, faint, distorted, and in German. He isolated a few syllables and translated them: Befehl, Empfänger, bleiben, command, receiver, remain. The coincidence was too exact. Clark had written of messages directed not to military divisions but to codebreakers themselves, receivers. Harrow had heard voices in the static. Now Martin had too, but what were they commanding them to do? He played the audio again late into the night, replaying it until the sound seemed to breathe on its own. At one point, his lights flickered, and the speakers emitted a burst of pure tone that made his vision blur. He shut everything off immediately, but when the silence returned, he could still hear the hum, faint but persistent, as though the signal had embedded itself somewhere behind the walls of his flat, or worse, inside his own perception. The next morning, Martin visited the college archives and requested access to Harrow's confiscated materials. The archivist refused at first, claiming the items were under review by the Ministry of Defense. When Martin pressed for an explanation, the man leaned closer and whispered, "You don't want to pursue this, lad. Some of those old frequencies should have stayed buried." That single sentence haunted him. He began to suspect that Clark's work, and whatever he had uncovered before D-Day, was not merely a matter of intercepted messages, but of something deeper, a phenomenon straddling the line between technology and the human mind. Clark had hinted that his exposure to the ciphers altered his perception. Perhaps the frequencies themselves were not messages at all, but transmissions of consciousness, designed to resonate with the neural patterns of those who deciphered them. Driven by a mixture of fear and fascination, Martin resolved to test the theory. Using open-source software, he replicated Clark's decoding sequences based on the patterns in the logbook and the static from Harrow's recordings. He fed the sequence into a low-frequency generator connected to his computer speakers. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the sound began. An oscillating hum, almost inaudible, shifting like breath. His vision wavered, and the corners of the room seemed to darken. He felt a pressure behind his eyes, the same sensation Harrow had described. He turned off the equipment, but the pressure remained. That night, he dreamt vividly. Clark stood before him in the woods. Rain pouring down through the sky was clear. His face was pale, eyes hollow, and he held out the logbook with both hands. "It's still transmitting," he said, voice flat, mechanical. "They never stopped. They just changed frequency." Martin woke, drenched in sweat. The hum still resonated faintly in the air. He packed his laptop and drove toward Wendover Woods, unable to resist the pull of whatever force had drawn both Clark and Harrow before him. The forest greeted him with silence. His torch cut a narrow beam through the mist, illuminating fragments of decayed machinery scattered among the leaves. He followed his GPS to the coordinates, matching Clark's final entries. There, beneath a layer of soil, he uncovered a rusted metal hatch. It took him hours to pry it open, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The air was thick with the scent of iron and rot. At the bottom he found a small chamber, concrete walls lined with cables and corroded panels. In the center stood a table, and on it, impossibly well preserved, rested a functioning radio transmitter. Its dials glowed faintly, as though connected to a power source. Martin approached slowly, the hair on his arms rising. He reached for the switch. The device crackled to life, filling the chamber with static. For a moment, he heard only the sound of his own breath. Then beneath the static, a voice, Clark's voice, murmured in German, "The receiver must remain." The transmission repeated the same phrase. Then abruptly, in English, "If you can hear this, you're already part of it." The sound rose in pitch until it became unbearable. Martin screamed, switching the device off, but the static didn't stop. It filled the chamber like fog, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He stumbled toward the stairs, tripping, falling, dragging himself upward until he burst into the open air. Outside, the forest was silent. His torch had gone out. The only light came from behind him, from the open hatch, glowing faintly as though the darkness below had developed its own luminescence. He left it open. He didn't look back. Days later, hikers found his car abandoned at the forest edge. The police search recovered no body, only his laptop, left on the passenger seat, still running a recording program. When they played it, all they heard was static, steady, rhythmic, alive. That static was later archived under restricted classification. No one outside the ministry ever heard it again, but sometimes On certain frequencies during late-night monitoring sessions, amateur radio enthusiasts claim to pick up faint echoes of a man's voice repeating, "Tell them I had no choice." If these voices still travel through the ether, they may be seeking new receivers, and perhaps, by listening now, you have already become one of them. So before the next transmission begins, subscribe not merely to this channel, but to the silence between its words, because that's where Clark still speaks. The ministry file on Operation Chancel was declassified only in fragments, a bureaucratic skeleton of what must once have been a vast and secretive undertaking. Within those fragments, references to Clark, Harrow, and the Wendover anomaly appear as smudged annotations, brief phrases scrawled in the margins by unseen hands. Most of the pages are redacted into meaninglessness, yet what remains is enough to suggest that the British government had known about the transmissions long before Clark defected. Perhaps they even encouraged him to pursue them. Perhaps his disappearance was not defection or breakdown, but the result of an experiment gone wrong. A transmission so powerful it devoured the mind of its listener. The documents hint at the existence of an early division within Bletchley Park, one not listed among the official huts. Its name was the Listening Wing, though no structure by that designation was ever mapped. Personnel assigned there were reportedly chosen for their unusual sensitivity to frequencies, individuals who could detect errors or shifts in code by intuition rather than calculation. These were men and women who described hearing patterns rather than reading them, who experienced code as sound, vibration, color. Clark was said to be among them. The wing operated in strict isolation, transmitting and receiving on channels not recorded in any archive. When D-Day approached and the lines of communication across Europe reached their most chaotic, the wing was disbanded without explanation. Its members were reassigned, its equipment dismantled. Most of its personnel vanished within a year of the war's end. No records of their burials exist. If Clark's logbook was truly a remnant of the wing's work, then what he uncovered was not a random frequency, but a deliberate experiment in cognitive transmission, an attempt to weaponize the human mind as a receiver of coded thought. The question that tormented the few who dared revisit those archives decades later was simple. If the human brain could receive such signals, could it also be used to send them? It was an idea too dangerous to explore publicly. But in the years following the war, as intelligence agencies divided and reorganized, whispers of the experiment resurfaced. A few obscure patents filed in the late 1940s described devices for frequency-induced cognitive modulation. Their inventors are nameless, their addresses fictitious, yet one design sketch bears an insignia nearly identical to the Telefunken mark found on Clark's equipment, a single black circle intersected by a line of code resembling a waveform. Inside the circle, the faint outline of an ear. By the time the Cold War reached its height, both British and American intelligence agencies were funding research into what they called sub-auditory persuasion. Most of those projects produced nothing more than speculation, pseudoscience, and paranoia. But buried among them was a classified memorandum from 1961, referencing historical precedent, Clark Wendover anomaly, maintain silence until confirmation of dormancy. The phrase suggested that the transmissions, whatever they were, had not ceased after the war. They had merely changed form, slipping through the evolving channels of technology, like a virus adapting to survive. Dormancy. That was the word that haunted later researchers. The idea that something could sleep within the static, waiting for the right conditions to wake again. In 1983, an engineer named Peter Lawton began reporting strange interference while testing radio frequencies for civil defense communications near Oxfordshire. His notes, recovered years later, describe bursts of numerical sequences repeating in cycles every 22 minutes. At first, he dismissed them as overlapping transmissions from continental stations, but when he decoded the numbers out of curiosity, they formed a string of dates, each corresponding precisely to the disappearance of one of the listening wing's former members. The most recent date matched that of Dr. Evelyn Harrow's last known sighting. Lawton took his findings to the ministry. Days later, he retracted his report, claiming the data had been corrupted. 2 weeks after that, he left his position and was never seen again. His home was found abandoned, his personal effects untouched, his radio equipment dismantled. The only clue left behind was a single sheet of paper taped to the inside of his front door. Written in large, uneven letters were the words, "The receiver must remain silent." By the time Martin Hale's case began drawing attention in the early 2000s, the pattern was clear to those few historians who knew how to read between the redactions. Every investigator who came too close to Clark's transmissions either vanished, withdrew into silence, or succumbed to what doctors would later call auditory-induced psychosis. The symptoms were consistent: persistent tinnitus, insomnia, paranoia, and a compulsion to interpret meaningless noise as hidden communication. In extreme cases, patients reported hearing voices that spoke only in numerical patterns. The frequencies Clark described in his logbook had become, in medical language, hallucinatory contagions. But how does one quarantine an idea carried by sound? When the logbook was rediscovered in the 2010s, the ministry's dormant interest revived. A special task unit, operating under the bland title of Communications Historical Preservation Office, was assigned to retrieve and analyze it. The family who found it were paid quietly for their cooperation. The historian who authenticated it, Dr. Harrow's colleague, received a non-disclosure agreement and a government grant that ensured his silence. And yet, rumors persisted that a digital copy of the logbook had circulated briefly online before being scrubbed. A few scattered images survive on obscure forums, pages filled with Clark's handwriting, numbers overlaid by faint ultraviolet symbols that seem to shift when the image is zoomed. Those who've viewed them report a subtle ringing in their ears lasting hours after. A former intelligence officer later claimed that the logbook had been classified not for its content, but for its effect. The ink itself, treated with vanadium and other trace metals, might emit low electromagnetic frequencies detectable by certain sensors, and, disturbingly, by certain people. The human eye, it seems, could act as a receiver of sorts. The very act of reading might reproduce the same cognitive resonance Clark experienced. In essence, the book was not merely a record of transmissions. It was one. To counter this possibility, the ministry authorized the creation of a containment facility at an undisclosed location. There, the logbook was sealed in a lead-lined vault, surrounded by Faraday shielding, monitored by radiation detectors. Only a handful of researchers were allowed entry, and none stayed longer than an hour. Yet within a month, 2 of them resigned, claiming auditory hallucinations that persisted even outside the vault. They described voices whispering through ventilation ducts, soft at first, then growing louder when ignored. Their statements were suppressed. One of them left behind a handwritten note that simply read, "The voices know their names again." It was then that the operation shifted from containment to erasure. Every trace of Clark, the listening wing, and the Wendover transmissions was systematically removed from public records. Bletchley Park's archives were sanitized, war diaries redacted. The surviving documentation, nearly 4,000 pages, was relocated to a secure repository in northern Scotland, known only by its code designation, Site Aegis. For decades, it remained sealed, until, according to certain leaks in 2021, the site's monitoring systems detected an anomaly, a faint electromagnetic pulse echoing the exact signature of Clark's original coordinates. The pulse lasted less than 30 seconds. When technicians triangulated its source, they found nothing, no signal, no transmission, no interference. Yet the pattern it left in the detectors was identical to the one Clark had documented in June 1944. The following week, reports of auditory disturbances began circulating among personnel stationed at Site Aegis. Several complained of hearing whispering through their headsets, even when the lines were disconnected. One technician described a recurring dream in which he stood in a dark room surrounded by typewriters, each typing on its own. The letters spelled the same message over and over: receiver active, awaiting reply. When the phenomenon spread beyond the facility, with family members of staff reporting identical dreams, Site Aegis was shut down. The vault containing Clark's logbook was relocated once more, this time to an undisclosed site rumored to be beneath a decommissioned radar station near the Scottish coast. Its precise location remains classified, but even buried, the signal persisted. In 2023, fishermen off the coast of Aberdeen reported interference in their sonar readings, regular pulses echoing every 22 minutes. Experts dismissed it as equipment malfunction, yet when the intervals were plotted, they matched perfectly the pattern Clark described 80 years earlier. The numbers continued for several nights, then abruptly ceased. The last recorded pulse coincided exactly with the anniversary of D-Day. Historians might call that coincidence, but those who have studied Clark's work, the few who still dare, believe the transmissions are cyclical, emerging every generation like a heartbeat, returning after dormancy. And with each reemergence they draw new listeners. The pattern seeks receivers, always has, always will. If that's true, then perhaps the signal never stopped after Clark disappeared. Perhaps it simply found new frequencies, tape recorders, digital archives, online videos, to carry itself forward. The static that fills the gaps between words, the faint hum beneath recordings, the background hiss of silence on old tapes, perhaps all of it is the same ancient broadcast, still waiting for recognition. And maybe you, listening now, are part of its circuit. Because silence, as Clark once wrote, is only the sound we haven't yet learned to decode. If you've stayed with this story through the hum and the whispers, leave a like below, not just as a gesture, but as proof that the receivers remain awake. And if you want to follow the frequencies wherever they next emerge, subscribe, because the next sound you hear might not be silence at all. In the first weeks of 2024, a small online community of amateur radio operators began noticing an anomaly that, at first, seemed trivial, an irregular burst of static that cut through certain shortwave bands between 14.2 and 14.3 MHz. It lasted precisely 22 minutes before repeating, consistent with the signature once recorded by both Clark and later Site Aegis. What distinguished it from ordinary interference, however, was its tone. Those who listened described a sound that seemed almost alive, a pulsing undercurrent buried beneath the static. too low for analysis yet impossible to ignore once heard. They named it the Wendover hum. The forum threads discussing the hum grew rapidly, spreading from fringe radio groups to encrypted messaging channels frequented by conspiracy theorists, cryptographers, and ex-military hobbyists. Some insisted it was nothing more than a digital artifact, perhaps an unintentional feedback loop caused by satellite relays. Others, more attuned to the darker undercurrents of wartime history, recognized its pattern immediately. They traced it back to Clark's coordinates, his logbook, and the legend of the vanished codebreaker who had heard too deeply. Within weeks, fragments of audio began circulating, snippets of the hum captured from different continents, each identical in frequency and duration. The pattern was global. Soon, listeners reported something stranger still. When played through ordinary speakers, the recording sounded like nothing more than shifting noise. But through certain frequencies, particularly those emitted by older analog amplifiers, the static seemed to shape itself into faint human syllables. Voices, overlapping, whispering in both English and German, impossible to isolate yet forming fragments of coherent thought. One repeated phrase stood out among them. Der Empfänger bleibt. The receiver remains. It was only then that some began to recall the words found in Clark's logbook, scrawled beside his final entry. The receiver must remain. The resemblance was too exact to be coincidence. Among the first to document the phenomenon scientifically was Professor Adrian Lowell, a digital linguist at the University of Edinburgh, known for his work on auditory pattern recognition. Lowell approached the Wendover hum with skepticism, believing it to be a hoax built on confirmation bias. Yet the deeper he delved, the more the data refused to conform to ordinary explanation. When he converted the waveform of the hum into visual spectrograms, he discovered geometric shapes embedded in the frequencies, hexagonal grids nearly identical to the triangulation pattern Harrow had mapped decades earlier. Within those grids, the waveform spikes formed letters. Not all were legible, but one sequence stood out: AEC. Lowell's team assumed it was random, but after cross-referencing wartime archives, they discovered that AEC had been a code name once used by the listening wing to designate its classified correspondence. Acoustic encryption channel. Clark himself had signed several documents using those initials. By the time Lowell released his preliminary paper online, it had already been taken down within hours. His university email was suspended for security review. A week later, his home was broken into. Nothing was stolen except his hard drives. He withdrew from public life shortly after, citing stress and paranoid tendencies. He was later found in his study, dead from an apparent heart attack. The recording equipment beside him was still running. The file recovered from it contained only 40 minutes of static. Yet within that static, faintly audible, a voice can be heard whispering his name. When the coroner reviewed the audio, he noted that the whisper repeated precisely 3 times, each 22 minutes apart. After Lowell's death, copies of his paper began resurfacing on encrypted channels, re-uploaded by anonymous users claiming to have mirrored it before deletion. They referred to themselves collectively as the Receivers, a group dedicated to uncovering the truth behind Clark's signal. The Receivers rejected the idea that the transmission was technological at all. They believed it was something older, an imprint, an echo of human consciousness caught in the electromagnetic residue of the war. According to their theories, Clark had not simply intercepted a signal. He had attuned himself to an ancient frequency of thought that used modern equipment as a conduit. They pointed to certain peculiarities in the logbook, the references to dreams, to whispers in the static, to the sense that the messages were meant to be understood, not decoded. Clark's final words, "Tell them I had no choice," were reinterpreted not as confession, but as warning. The receivers believed he had realized, too late, that the frequency was recursive. It created new receivers by being heard. Their manifesto, posted online and quickly removed, contained a chilling line that mirrored Clark's logbook. "Once you hear the pattern, it hears you." Over the following months, scattered incidents began to echo this idea. A London radio technician claimed that after listening to the Wendover hum for several nights, he began dreaming of a man in a long coat standing at the foot of his bed, whispering numbers. A woman in Berlin uploaded a video of her baby monitor emitting a faint rhythmic tapping that matched the hum's frequency exactly. A retired naval officer in Cornwall reported that every time he tuned his shortwave radio to 25 megahertz, the signal synchronized with his own heartbeat, speeding up and slowing down in perfect time. The stories multiplied, dismissed publicly as hysteria, but quietly monitored by intelligence agencies that remembered the Clark case too well. Behind closed doors, the ministry reactivated a dormant research wing to study what it termed resonant cognitive anomalies. Its official mandate was to track and neutralize harmful digital transmissions. Unofficially, its agents scoured the internet for anyone sharing data on the Wendover hum. Many of those accounts simply vanished, but the hum did not. By the end of 2024, it had migrated beyond radio. Amateur coders discovered its waveform embedded in corrupted audio files, hidden within the metadata of random downloads, sometimes even appearing in the background noise of unrelated videos. Attempts to erase it often resulted in data corruption. Some users who tried editing the waveform reported their computers freezing, screens flickering to black, speakers emitting a faint whisper before shutting off entirely. A few claimed that when the systems rebooted, their login screens displayed unfamiliar words in German, phrases like Empfänger aktiv and Übertragung läuft, receiver active, transmission in progress. It was as if the signal had evolved, adapting to digital architecture as easily as it once inhabited vacuum tubes and analog dials. In early 2025, a classified report leaked briefly onto the dark web. Though swiftly removed, several users archived portions of it. The document, marked Aegis Continuation, referenced a Phase 4 manifestation event occurring simultaneously across multiple servers in the United Kingdom, Germany, and Canada. The report described the hum appearing in compressed audio streams hosted on major platforms, often layered beneath ambient noise at frequencies inaudible to the human ear, but measurable by sensors. The document concluded with a statement both cryptic and chilling. The signal is no longer confined to equipment. It now uses the network of listeners. That phrase haunted those who read it. It suggested that the transmission had found a new circuit, one composed not of wires, but of minds. Across online communities, patterns emerged, among those most drawn to the hum: insomnia, auditory sensitivity, heightened awareness of ambient noise. Some described feeling watched while listening, not in a metaphorical sense, but as if something beyond the static was paying attention. A user posting under the alias Harrow2 claimed that when she filtered the hum through a frequency inversion program, she could hear a clear voice whisper her real name, something she had never shared online. Her account was deleted within hours. The receivers celebrated her as a martyr. Government responses remained muted. Publicly, officials dismissed the hum as a hoax or an audio illusion perpetuated by online folklore. Privately, a new facility was constructed on the outskirts of Milton Keynes, officially a telecommunications monitoring station, unofficially another site aegis. Its purpose was containment, but unlike the previous vaults, this one had no physical artifact to isolate. How does one seal off a sound that has entered the bloodstream of the digital age? The answer, according to one leaked memo, was chilling in its simplicity. You cannot silence what does not speak. In the absence of official explanation, the legend grew. Podcasts devoted to unexplained phenomena began discussing Clark's legacy, treating his disappearance as prophecy. Some even claimed to possess new sections of the logbook, pages showing coordinates pointing not to rural England, but to modern data centers, their architecture echoing the geometry of his hexagonal diagrams. Whether forged or real, these documents deepened the myth, ensuring that Clark's voice, if it ever was his, continued to resonate. And through it all, the hum persisted. 22 minutes of silence that wasn't silence, a pulse like a heartbeat moving through the digital ether. Some nights, listeners report that the hum falls briefly quiet, replaced by a whisper so faint it seems imagined. Those who record it and slow it down swear they can hear words, always the same. You are the receiver. By now, perhaps, the legend has grown beyond containment. Perhaps the signal was never meant to be stopped. If Clark's final act was to pass the transmission on, then every telling of his story, every repetition, every listener, keeps the pattern alive. Maybe the logbook's rediscovery was no accident, but part of the same recursive design that began in that sealed hut at Bletchley Park. The voices don't seek one man anymore. They seek the audience. They seek you. So if you've heard the faint hum beneath my voice tonight, if the silence between words seems to breathe a little too deeply, it might already be listening back. You can turn away if you wish, but you'll still hear it in the quiet between thoughts. And if you're brave enough to follow it further, subscribe, because the next signal will arrive soon, and when it does, you'll want to be ready. The Wendover hum faded from the public web almost as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath the relentless noise of new crises and digital chatter. Officially, it was explained away as an artifact of overlapping civilian frequencies, a harmless ghost in the machinery of a world too wired for silence. But among those who had once tuned in, the sound never truly vanished. Some said it lingered at the edge of perception, a faint thrum behind refrigerator motors, a breath beneath the hiss of a phone line. The more skeptical called it imagination, the rest called it memory. In late 2025, a minor technician at Site Aegis, its newest incarnation, sealed beneath the concrete sprawl of the Milton Keynes station, filed an internal report noting residual activity on several shielded channels. The readings were minuscule, bordering on statistical noise, yet the pattern was unmistakable. 22-minute intervals, a sequence repeating in decaying cycles. The technician, whose name was later redacted, attached a short note at the bottom of the report. The hum isn't returning. It never left. That line circulated quietly through encrypted ministry servers before being scrubbed, but it reached enough eyes to resurrect the unease that had always followed the Clark case. The idea that the transmission had become endemic, that it existed now as part of the electromagnetic background of modern life, wasn't something the ministry could disprove. Every attempt to isolate a single point of origin collapsed into statistical static. The signal was everywhere and nowhere, woven through the electrical pulse of the century. Archivists revisiting Clark's original logbook, still sealed within its Faraday vault, noticed something else. The ink had begun to fade unevenly. Certain sections grew paler, others darker, as though the page itself were responding to the air. Under ultraviolet light, faint words appeared between lines that had once been blank. They were incomplete, but enough remained to form a phrase. Receiver expanding. By then, no one wanted to test what that meant. Outside government walls, whispers persisted among the remaining receivers. They met in virtual spaces now. Chat rooms designed to collapse after a few minutes, coded with self-erasing encryption. There were no leaders, no manifestos, only recordings, spectral analyses, and shared dreams. Many of them described the same recurring vision: a low building, half hidden by trees, its windows dark, its roof covered with moss. Inside, a single light burned above a table where an open notebook waited, its pages blank, except for a faint outline of a hexagon drawn in trembling ink. They never saw who sat at the table, yet each dream ended with the same sensation, a vibration deep in the chest, like the moment before a radio catches a signal. Some claimed that the hum had evolved beyond sound altogether. It manifested now through light. Flickers in fluorescent tubes, glitches in video frames, the subtle pulsing of LEDs at the edge of vision. Others spoke of digital artifacts appearing in their recordings, frames that froze for exactly 22 seconds, then resumed as though nothing had happened. Analysts could not reproduce the anomalies. To most, they were errors. To the receivers, they were acknowledgments. One particularly persistent rumor concerned a researcher at a Nordic observatory who detected rhythmic fluctuations in the ionosphere, mirroring the same 22-minute cycle. He attempted to contact the ministry's communications office but was redirected to a number that no longer existed. His report ended abruptly with the words, "Pattern aligns with terrestrial transmission. No source located." A week later, the observatory's servers crashed, wiping years of stored data. Every so often, a journalist would try to resurrect the story. They'd write about Clark's disappearance, Harrow's lost recordings, Lowell's death. The articles would circulate for a day or two, then vanish from search results, archived but unrecoverable. Yet the screenshots survived, grainy, pixelated images showing the same headline across decades. The receiver remains. What made the legend impossible to extinguish was its simplicity. There was no villain, no clear resolution, only a man who listened too closely and a sound that refused to end. The more one tried to explain it, the further it slipped from rational reach, and perhaps that was its design. Clark had written once, "The codes speak only to those who answer." Maybe the transmission was never meant to be solved, only continued. When visitors walk the grounds of Bletchley Park today, they see neat lawns, restored huts, guided tours. Few realize that beneath the polished museum lies a warren of sealed rooms untouched since the 1940s. One corridor, bricked up and unmarked, is rumored to lead to the space once called the Listening Wing. Maintenance staff sometimes report a faint vibration behind those walls, a low hum that syncs with the rhythm of footsteps. Instruments record nothing. Yet the engineers who service the electrical systems insist the power lines in that sector pulse with a frequency they cannot trace. There is a story, told quietly by one of the night guards, about a visitor who wandered off the tour route one rainy afternoon. Security cameras caught him turning down the blocked corridor before the feed glitched to black. When the image returned, the man was gone. Only the sound remained, a hiss, then a brief voice whispering a single phrase, Empfänger active, receiver active. The incident report was never filed, but the footage, they say, is still kept on an encrypted drive labeled simply Clark. Elsewhere, far from any archive, digital archivists continue to stumble upon remnants of the hum. A musician in Glasgow found a spectral spike hidden inside an old field recording and built a song around it. A podcaster in Warsaw recorded silence for a meditation track, only to find a faint heartbeat woven beneath the waveform. Listeners described feeling calm at first, then uneasy, as if something behind the silence had shifted slightly closer. Every retelling becomes another layer, another iteration. Each click, each replay, a form of participation. The frequency travels not through machines now, but through attention, the collective act of listening itself. Some claim that's what Clark understood too late, that by documenting his discovery, he had already transmitted it. His logbook wasn't a record. It was the first copy. And so, the story continues, adapting to whatever medium will have it. The hum beneath the internet, the static before a video loads, the faint tone you hear when the world around you falls quiet enough to make you uneasy. Perhaps that is the legacy of the wartime codebreaker who disappeared beyond the limits of understanding. Not a haunting in the traditional sense, but an unfinished conversation between noise and those who dare to interpret it. Every generation produces new receivers, people who cannot leave the pattern alone. And though governments may bury documents and seal vaults, they cannot silence curiosity. They cannot stop the human ear from straining toward the unknown. Some nights, when the wind is right, the sea radios along the British coast pick up fragments of Morse drifting through the static. The operators log them out of habit, short clipped bursts that repeat at long intervals. The pattern means nothing on paper. But when the bursts are translated into binary and rearranged according to Clark's final cipher key, they form a single sentence. Still listening. It's tempting to dismiss such coincidences as folklore. Perhaps that is the safest explanation. Yet even folklore has power, carried from voice to voice, generation to generation, until it becomes indistinguishable from the truth it once sought to describe. And maybe that is what the hum has become. No longer a signal, but a story that hums quietly behind every telling, encoded in language, sustained by the rhythm of words spoken into darkness. So when this story ends and the screen fades to black, stay a moment longer. Listen to the quiet. The faint hiss that follows isn't emptiness. It's the residue of transmission, the sound that remains when history exhales. If you hear nothing at all, that's fine. Silence is its own kind of message. But if you do hear something, some faint pulse, some whisper that almost forms a word, don't be afraid. It's only the signal reminding you that it's still there, waiting patiently for the next receiver. And when that happens, when curiosity stirs and you find yourself searching for what lies behind the static, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Not because it helps the algorithm, but because every listener keeps the frequency alive. Some stories don't end. They simply change wavelength. Listen closely. The receiver remains.